I'm Ben Grapevine, and this is The Grapevine.
I was in the land of cotton, old times are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, in Dixieland where I was born.
April 9th, 1865. At Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, a town named after a building, General Robert E. Lee, highest officer of the Confederate Army, formally surrenders to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in the house of a local grocer. Here, after 4 years of conflict and devastation, the American Civil War is over. And while last-ditch efforts at Confederate unity and resistance will continue into late 1865, the Southern cause is considered all but lost. In May, Confederate President Jefferson Davis is captured after dissolving his government. The Confederate States of America, a nation no more. To many of the soldiers of the Confederate Army, the surrender and loss of their newly built nation is incredibly disheartening. Across the South sweeps a sentiment of disappointment and disbelief at the prospect of peaceful unity with the North. In the coming years, most Southerners, even the most proud rebels among them, will follow the advice of General Lee and reacclimate to life in the United States. But some won't. Today's story isn't about the United States, or even the Confederacy, but instead those men and women who loved their newborn nation so much they refused to live where it died. This is the story of the post-Civil War Confederate exodus that built American colonies in Mexico, Central America, and perhaps most importantly, Brazil. While most Confederate soldiers and citizens endured the process of Reconstruction and gradually accepted their reabsorption into the United States, this is the story of those who didn't. For some of these men and women, the prospect of living under the government of an angry enemy was enough to inspire exodus. For many others, the idea of the new social order created by the emancipation of slaves brought up feelings of faithlessness and apprehension. It's one thing to want to leave. It's another to know where to go. By the end of the Civil War, a number of Central and South American leaders had made clear their interest in attracting white settlers. Among these leaders is Maximilian I, Emperor of Mexico. In 1865, Maximilian's position is unsteady. A younger brother of the Austrian emperor with no ties to Mexico, Maximilian had been all but given his position of power by the French emperor Napoleon III and members of the limited Mexican aristocracy. Interested in preserving monarchism and gaining a royalist ally in the Americas, Napoleon, grandson of the famed French emperor and general, staged a French intervention in Mexico and declared Maximilian emperor, opting to ignore the existing government of President Benito Juarez. Maximilian ascended the throne in 1863 and sought to undertake a series of national reforms that would modernize the country. To expedite his endeavor, Maximilian made clear his interest in accommodating white and European settlers, word that traveled quickly to Confederate soldiers and generals as they neared the end of the Civil War. Prospective immigrants would be offered free passage between 320 and 640 acres of land, freedom of religion and from taxation, and total exemption from military service for 5 years. After the surrender at Appomattox, as many as thousands of Confederate veterans and civilians took the Mexican emperor up on his offer, crossing the Rio Grande into unfamiliar territory, having forsaken their motherland for new opportunity. To bolster their ranks, Maximilian appointed a commissioner of colonization and placed a Confederate general, John B. Magruder, at the head of the National Land Office. For the most part, Maximilian's attempt to inspire Confederate immigration is successful, and a mixture of Confederate generals, soldiers, and citizens begin to settle in what will be known as the New Virginia colony. Inside this colony, the largest and most prominent settlement is the city of Carlotta, named after Maximilian's wife, Charlotte of Belgium, or Carlota, now that she's decided she's Mexican. Envisioned as a beautiful city, Carlota never quite achieved that designation, according to historian Andrew F. Rolle, who commented on its general air of impermanence, suggesting this was a town not built to last. His desired immigrants in place in New Virginia, Maximilian sought to give the Confederates a significant degree of autonomy, hoping that they would serve as a fortified barrier against Mexico's native inhabitants and the Republicans still loyal to President Benito Juarez. Soon, though, the local natives took to harassing the colonists, who had little luck defending themselves and no additional aid from the imperial government. Business and trade were difficult for the colonists, but a small few found success, among them Confederate General Joseph Shelby, who had managed to establish a profitable wagon train. With little success to be had in trading with the locals, Shelby and his train eventually established a deal to supply the local French military garrison. Though a profitable trading partner, the French were viewed as an occupying enemy by President Juarez and his Warista guerrilla army, and the supply train received regular harassment and at least one direct attack by Warist forces. Meanwhile, having been put in power by a foreign government still struggling to defeat local resistance and insurrection, Maximilian found difficulty exerting his government's power and authority across Mexico. With war prospects already uncertain, the tide began to shift heavily with pressure and involvement from the United States. Unsympathetic to the idea of the Mexican Empire from the beginning, the post-Civil War U.S. now had the resources to act against it. American Secretary of State William Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine, a cornerstone of American foreign policy asserting the United States' right to defend North and South America from any attempt at European intervention. Not interested in a conflict with the United States, Emperor Napoleon announced the occupying French forces would withdraw from the country. Wasting no time, Juarez and his Republican forces embarked on an incredibly successful campaign against Maximilian's imperial government. Having established himself in the city of Querétaro, Maximilian found himself trapped as the Republican army besieged the city in March of 1867. Following a failed counteroffensive, the emperor resolved to escape the city. 4 days later, he was captured by Republican forces. And despite appeals for leniency by European aristocrats, Juarez ordered Maximilian's execution a month later, officially killing the Mexican Empire. Without the French to defend the colony, New Virginia was almost immediately retaken by the Waristas. Their colony abandoned, survivors of the assault attempted briefly to survive in Mexico, but most left the country following Maximilian's execution. In his book, The Lost Cause, The Confederate Exodus in Mexico, Andrew F. Rolle writes, "We do not have a full picture of the Confederate colonies in Mexico, mostly because virtually nothing is left of them." A group of settlers driven by the idea that life in the southern United States would be absolutely unsustainable and that their fortunes in Mexico would be much brighter, found themselves departing a collapsed country. From its inception to its ultimate demise, the New Virginia colony lasted only 2 years. Outside of Mexico, Confederates leaving the United States settled elsewhere in Central America and the Caribbean, with an indeterminate number of Confederates departing for at least one colony in British Honduras, a country now known as Belize. It's difficult to find information on the British Honduras colony for the same reason it may have been successful. Confederate migrants were apparently drawn to the British territory because it was one of few settled areas in the Americas where most residents spoke English. Where Confederates elsewhere have retained elements of their American culture, any descendants of those who moved to British Honduras don't appear to have maintained a Confederate identity. Around the world, or at least the Western Hemisphere, Confederate colonies and settlements seem to rise and fall with ease. The Confederate colonies in Central America leave us little to remember them by, but further south, things are going a little differently. The story of Brazil's Confederados starts with Dom Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil. Unlike Maximilian, Pedro was beloved by the Brazilian people. Given the nickname the Magnanimous, Pedro was the second emperor of an independent Brazil, having succeeded his father, Pedro I. Dom Pedro wanted educated Western immigrants for the same reason his Mexican counterpart did, but the efforts he would go through to obtain them would be done without the same backdrop of war and illegitimacy. But that doesn't make them any less interesting. While Maximilian relied largely on his appointed ex-Confederate officials to create back channels and encouragement for immigration, Pedro's approach was more hands-on. The Brazilian government took out newspaper ads in cities all over the American South, from New Orleans to Charleston, advertising attractive land subsidies to prospective immigrants. At and beyond the war's end, despite appeals to stay from General Lee and former President Jefferson Davis, an estimated 10,000 Southerners would eventually make the journey to Brazil. At this point, while it's not exactly a mass exodus, Brazil is attracting a significant number of former Americans where other countries aren't. Sure, Brazil seems more stable than Mexico, and maybe more economically powerful than British Honduras, but what sets Brazil aside from anywhere else in South America, Europe, and beyond? The answer is that Brazil has an angle its competitors don't. Unlike Mexico, British Honduras, and the rest of the Western world, in Brazil, slavery is still legal. In 1850, Emperor Dom Pedro outlawed the importing of new slaves to the Brazilian Empire, but to prospective immigrants, that might not matter. According to figures from the New York Times, while North America imported 389,000 slaves from Africa, Brazil took in 4.9 million. A ban on importing new slaves may make them more complicated to acquire, but it doesn't exactly make it difficult. The New York Times piece includes an interview with Luciana da Cruz Brito, a Brazilian historian focusing on slavery at the City University of New York. In her interview, Brito details the 1866 acquisition of 40 slaves in Brazil for $12,500, about $188,000 today, or far cheaper than the same number would have cost in the United States. For the Confederados uninterested in purchasing new slaves, there were always the ones they already had. Sure, because of Brazil's law against importing new slaves, these men and women were technically free, but in practice, they existed in a state of servitude not much different from the institution of slavery itself. Former Confederate slaves didn't speak Portuguese, had no ties to anything or anyone in Brazil, and had no money or resources to go elsewhere. Slavery in Brazil would retain its legal status for 23 years after the end of the American Civil War. As support for slavery in Brazil waned, Confederate immigrants fought against its abolition in Brazil much as they had in the United States. In 1888, months before Pedro officially outlawed the practice, 2 Confederado immigrants led a mob that orchestrated and executed a lynching of a local abolitionist police chief as his family watched. The topic of slavery is as indivisible from the Confederate colonies in Brazil as it was from their homeland to the north. In an interview with the New York Times, historian Maria Helen Machado of the University of Sao Paulo argues that, quote, many of the Confederate immigrants were remorseless white supremacists, end quote, suggesting their motivation for going into self-exile was to maintain a system of racial supremacy that could no longer exist in the United States. Still, just as not all Southerners in the United States were closely acquainted with slavery, not all of the Confederados were motivated by its loss. Another historian interviewed by the New York Times, Gerald Horne of the University of Houston, acknowledges a theme of white supremacism in the Confederate exodus, but argues that, quote, while many simply endured a sour distaste when contemplating a different kind of relationship with Africans than what had existed previously, end quote. It's impossible to divorce the context of slavery from both American Confederates and Brazilian Confederados, and it'd be misinterpreting history to suggest that slavery played even just a minor role in the Civil War and subsequent series of Confederate exoduses. Still, it's important to remember that the vast majority of Southerners in the United States never owned slaves. Their legacy may still be one tainted by racism and discrimination, but what we're looking at here is a situation turned upside down almost overnight. The decision to leave isn't a single one, but a web of complicated arguments and options, many of which were unapproachable to the wives and families that accompanied those who had elected to emigrate from the United States. Whatever their reason, they went. Mostly built in the relatively urban outskirts of Sao Paulo, the Confederate colonies in Brazil experienced a greater degree of success than their brethren in Mexico and Central America, but they weren't without difficulty. Brazil's Confederado settlements are unique in that a significant number of settlers stayed, but most didn't. By and large, the Confederate immigrants found it difficult to acclimate to the Brazilian culture and economy, and most left within a few years. Tropical diseases and comparably primitive living conditions expedited the process. While the Confederados retained their American Southerner identity, they didn't refuse acculturation outright. Between 1866 and today, the Confederados would come to learn and accept Portuguese as their native language, and intermarrying with Brazilian natives became common. Still, their foreign identity remained, bolstered by the abundance of Protestant churches and English-language schools, as well as a taste for Southern-style food. Overall, the Portuguese-speaking Confederados remained largely American, a fact future President Jimmy Carter would remark on in a visit to the Confederados region in 1972. Carter later noted that he was surprised to find that many of the local people spoke English not with a Brazilian accent, but instead one he'd come to understand as Georgian. Today, estimates put the population of Confederado descendants in Brazil somewhere within the thousands. While most Confederate colonies in Central and South America failed quickly, with colonists and immigrants swiftly moving to established local cities or returning to the United States, the Sao Paulo municipality of Americana, founded by an Alabaman colonel and his followers, lives on even today. Now a part of the expanding city of Sao Paulo, the municipality boasts a population of 225,000. Americana lays claim to Brazil's largest rodeo arena and each year plays host to a festa, or festival, for the Fraternidade Descendencia Americana, the Brotherhood of Confederate Descendants in Brazil. At the festa, the mood is one of antebellum and wartime Southern jubilance. Attendees wear 10-gallon hats, hoop skirts, Confederate military uniforms, and a liberally emblazoned Confederate battle flag. The debate over Confederate symbols now present in the United States isn't heard here, at an event that draws visitors from all over Brazil, from the diaspora of Confederados to locals and enthusiasts from across the country and beyond. Even today, over a century and a half after the first Confederados settled in Brazil, interested American Southerners arrive to marvel at the foreign festival that seems to so accurately echo their own cultural experiences. The festivities have grown large enough to draw a sizable crowd, and a local subculture has erupted, in part around the Confederados. The New York Times reports on testimony by a local wearing a bandana emblazoned with the Confederate battle flag and a t-shirt reading "Hillbilly Treasure," a song by Hillbilly Rawhide, a local Brazilian band whose members perform Southern-style country music and sing in English rather than Portuguese. Though the festa, like the city, endures a legacy of slavery and discrimination, the event makes an effort to emphasize heritage over hate, a motto they espouse with pride. At the event's gates, Vice reports that guards check visitors for symbols outlined in 4 pages of documented hate imagery, from the Nazi swastika and sig runes of the German SS to images associated with the Ku Klux Klan. The legacy of the American Confederates is still one of controversy and conflict over 150 years after the Civil War. Wartime symbols like the Confederate battle flag continue to spur divisive debate between groups that see it as a symbol of heritage and pride and those who argue it represents an era of discrimination and hardship for millions of people. Keep in mind the Confederate battle flag is not the Confederate flag, but it's come to symbolize the nation and movement it's associated with. Those who flew the flag definitely interpreted it differently than those who existed under it, a divide which still exists today. Likewise, the Confederado descendants who lived thousands of miles from the American border view the flag and its associated imagery in their own localized context. It's impossible to ignore centuries of human subjugation and enslavement, and it's hard to make the argument that we should try for the sake of getting along. Still, the festa and its attachment to the ideal of heritage over hate makes me wonder if it's possible to acknowledge the darker side of a symbol while still appreciating its other ideals. It's hard to argue the Confederate battle flag was first sewn to symbolize anything but a group of states rising up to defend the ruling Southern system, one that emphasized the system of slavery that stood at its core. But it's not so difficult to accept that, over several generations, a symbol with one meaning during the war may have come to represent something else for families and individual people. The past is definite, but today is flexible. The Confederados built a colony to remember the Confederacy by, and their descendants still remember. But what they remember may not be as important as how they remember it. The Confederados acknowledge the Confederacy and its history of slavery and mistreatment, but they don't seem to celebrate it. Ultimately, the burden of interpretation isn't individual, but one we all bear. But this isn't a podcast about Confederate flags. A year ago, I didn't know the Confederados existed. As I wrote this podcast, their descendants held their 30th festa in Americana. There's a video of the festa on YouTube. Its description is in Portuguese, but it ends as follows. For 30 years, the FDA has celebrated these families as a way of thanking them for their contributions and lessons, and so we will continue. And so they will. The Grapevine is written and produced by me, Ben Grapevine. Special thanks to the New York Times and Vice News, whose pieces formed the backbone of my understanding of the Confederados and their modern festival. Thanks also to Andrew F. Rolle, whose book, The Lost Cause, informed a lot of the discussion on Mexico and the New Virginia colony, as well as the History.com piece, Who Were the Confederados, and Ronan Farrow's The World of the Confederados from MSNBC. I opened this podcast with Dixie, the Confederacy's de facto national anthem, and talked extensively about the Confederate battle flag and its reputation. The song was popularized in blackface minstrel shows, and the battle flag is, you know. These are cornerstone elements of the Confederate culture, but what they were in 1862 isn't what they are now. For the purposes of this piece, I spoke to the Confederado interpretation of the Confederate symbols, but their views are not necessarily my own. If you're interested in learning more about the Confederate exiles and the Confederados, there's a surprising amount of content out there if you dig enough. I recommend all of the sources I listed above as places to start. The New York Times and Vice actually sent reporters down to the Festa, and they wrote much more on it than I did. There's also a lot of history that I wanted to include in this podcast but eventually cut, like the New Texas colony, whose settlers shipwrecked on Cuba on their way to Brazil, tried again and made it, only for their leader to die of tuberculosis 2 years later. There's also the story of Commodore Andrew Maury, whose personal friendship with Emperor Maximilian led directly to the settlement of the New Virginia colony in Mexico. There are several books about him available if you're interested. Again, special thanks to those of you who have supported this project since Goat Ball, and to those of you just listening now. I've appreciated all the feedback I've received so far, and I'm always happy to hear what you think. This one took a long time to produce, and I hope it's worth the wait. Thanks again.